Right now, you are likely feeling the persistent, prickly tension of someone trying to tape a torn page back into the middle of a story, afraid that if you let the paper fall, the narrative of your life will simply stop making sense. You are pacing through the hallways of your own history, constantly checking to see if the binding is still holding, terrified that a single loose edge will reveal the blank, terrifying expanse of the page you are meant to write next. The room around you is thick with the scent of dust and ancient, drying ink, and the only sound is the rhythmic, restless fluttering of a loose parchment caught in an evening draft. You have been living in this archive of completed chapters for so long, rereading your past mistakes and underlining your failures, that the weight of the book in your hands has become a physical ache, pulling at your shoulders and tethering your heartbeat to things that finished years ago. You are not broken because you fear the blank space, and what you are feeling is not a lack of courage, it is the natural, human instinct to protect yourself from the unknown. Tonight, we will not force the mind to turn the page, nor will we pretend that you must feel ready for whatever comes next. We will learn to sit with the weight of the book, discovering that the stories you are so desperate to keep bound are already written, and that the emptiness you fear is actually the only place where something new can begin. You do not need to solve the architecture of your future tonight, nor do you need to justify the length of your past. You are safe enough to set the heavy volume aside, and for these hours, nothing is required of your intellect. You do not have to be the librarian of your own regrets tonight. You only have to be the person who allows their hands to finally fall open. There is a strange, quiet paradox here. The more energy you spend trying to hold the past in place to ensure you remain who you were, the less you are actually able to inhabit the person you are becoming. Buddhist wisdom suggests that we are not the books we have authored, but the awareness that observes the turning of the page. We are taught to believe that our identity is a finished manuscript that must be preserved at all costs. But suffering arises precisely when we confuse the static ink of yesterday with the living, breathing movement of this moment. When you stop fighting the reality of the page turn, you do not lose your history. You finally allow your history to become the foundation for something that has room to breathe. If it feels right, notice the way the air in this room creates a gentle, unseen barrier between you and the archives of your mind. Feel the way your palms are resting against the fabric of the bed, no longer gripping a spine, no longer squeezing the pages of yesterday. The cool evening light is spilling across the floor, and in this dim amber glow, you might imagine setting the heavy, iron-bound book down on a table of solid, unyielding stone. Feel the muscles in your forearms unclench as the weight leaves your grasp. Imagine the sudden, impossible lightness of having empty hands. There is no urgency in this darkness. The story of your life does not require your active editing to continue. It is being written by the simple fact of your heartbeat, by the grace of your breathing, and by the vast open potential of the empty page that is waiting for the dawn. Maybe you have felt this way for cycles, the feeling that if you were to truly let the page turn, if you were to walk away from the rereading of your own narrative, you would lose your sense of self entirely. You have been living in a state of perpetual anxious vigilance, hovering over your own life like a scholar obsessed with a single flawed sentence. You think that by fixing the past, you are securing the future, but you are only missing the present. This state of constant preoccupation is what makes the night feel like a labyrinth instead of a sanctuary. It is why true rest feels like an abandonment of duty. But tonight, we will not ask you to let go of your history in a way that feels dangerous. We will simply notice that the book you are holding is finished and that the library you are in is a place for resting, not for labor. The mind, in its search for security, desperately wants to stay within the chapters it already knows, because even a painful reread story is more predictable than the silence of the unwritten. It tells you that your value is bound to the quality of the prose you have already composed, and that if you dare to step into the blankness, you will disappear. But you are not a character caught in a plot that someone else dictates. You are the consciousness that perceives the ink, the parchment, and the movement of the wind. You are not a vessel that needs to store its past to maintain its form. You are a living, evolving presence. You are not a volume that must be shelved. You are the light that allows the words to be seen. Take a slow breath, and as you do, notice how the air moves through your chest without your permission or your planning. Your lungs do not need to be reminded how to expand, they know the rhythm of the living. Your blood does not need to be prompted to circulate, it knows the timing of the circulation. There is a deep, ancient intelligence in your biology that knows how to exist, how to repair, and how to surrender to the necessity of change. You can lean into that wisdom tonight. You can trust that the same force that turns the seasons and draws the tide is also turning the pages of your own story. You are not floating through this life on your own, unsupported and adrift. You are held by the reality of the present, and the present is not interested in the punctuation of your past. You might be wondering if you are doing this right, if you are releasing the binding enough, or if your thoughts are still reaching for the quill. Please hear this. There is no right way to be in this space. If your mind wanders back to the chapters you feel you must edit, that is simply the mind doing what it has practiced for years. You do not need to scold it. You do not need to pull it back with force. Just acknowledge the drift, like watching a cloud pass over the peak of a distant, snow-covered mountain, and then gently return your awareness to the weight of your body, the presence of this stillness. You are not required to be enlightened tonight. You are not required to be finished. You are only required to be present with whatever you are feeling, even if that feeling is a reluctance to let go or a fear of what the silence contains. Even that fear is just another paragraph in the book, and you are the one who is currently reading it. We will sit with these paragraphs, offering them the quiet of our attention, but we will not give them the power to define the ending of the story. You are the host of this evening, and as the host, you have the authority to let the book be closed, and to let the night be just as it is. In a moment, we will step into a story of a scholar who wandered into a library where the books were being surrendered to the fire, not out of destruction, but out of necessity. This story may feel significant, not because you have heard it before, but because you have lived the struggle of holding on to things that are already complete. It is the beginning of a shift, a way to see the parchment in your own hands and wonder what might happen if you were to simply let the pages fan out in the wind. The darkness is not a void, it is a canvas for you to finally be unburdened. And tonight, we are letting the ink of your history dry and fade into the deep, restorative shade of the night. You are doing well. Just be here, in this breath, in this quiet, with nowhere else to go and nothing left to rewrite. In a province where the morning fog often clung to the eaves of the low wooden houses like damp wool, there lived a scholar named Kalen who was responsible for the imperial archives. It was a vast, silent structure built of gray stone, filled with thousands of scrolls that traced the history of the realm, the genealogies of kings, and the minute details of agricultural yields. Kalen was a man who lived his life in the past. He spent his days in the dust-choked aisles, obsessed with the belief that if he could just keep every record in perfect order, if he could ensure that not a single piece of parchment was torn or misplaced, then the present would remain orderly and safe. He was terrified of the blank space. Whenever he encountered a damaged scroll, he would spend days meticulously gluing tiny strips of silk to the tiers, trying to restore the history to a state that no longer existed. The chief librarian of the archives was an old woman who moved through the aisles like smoke. She never spoke of history. She never spoke of the importance of preservation. She only tended to the lamps, ensuring they were trimmed and that the oil was fresh. One rainy afternoon, as Kalen was hunched over a particularly brittle genealogy, frantic because a page had crumbled under his touch, the librarian walked by. She stopped, watched his trembling hands as he tried to tape the fragments back together, and then gestured for him to follow her. She led him out of the main hall, through a series of narrow, winding corridors, until they reached a small, windowless chamber deep in the heart of the temple. In the center of the room stood an iron brazier, and beside it was a tall stack of completed manuscripts, works that Kalen recognized as the early records of the province, now fully transcribed and verified. The librarian picked up one of the scrolls, opened it to verify that the ink was dry and the text was clear, and then, without a single tremor of hesitation, she laid it into the heart of the fire. Kalen gasped. reaching out as if to catch the dying sparks, his heart hammering against his ribs. It was an act of madness. It was the destruction of the very thing he had given his life to protect. He collapsed onto his knees, his hands reaching for the fire, but the librarian gently placed a hand on his shoulder. She pointed to the shelf of transcripts, then to the fire. "You are holding a mountain of paper," she said, her voice like the shifting of dry leaves. "But you are not looking for the truth, you are looking for the shelf space." She picked up a second scroll, but this time she handed it to Kalen. It was a heavy iron-bound volume that he had been trying to repair for months. It was filled with the accounts of a drought that had occurred a century ago, a record that he had read so many times he knew the phrasing by heart. She did not tell him to burn it. She simply walked out of the room, leaving him alone with the fire, the manuscript, and the silence. Kalen sat there for hours, the heat of the brazier warming his face, watching the light dance against the stone walls. He looked at the iron-bound book, the edges frayed, the binding cracked, the ink fading into the parchment. He had built his entire identity around this record. He believed that he was the guardian of the drought. He believed that if this book were lost, the drought would somehow happen again, or that he would lose his place in the world. He felt the weight of it in his lap, an anchor that kept him tethered to a century he had never lived, in a history that had already passed. He realized with a sudden, startling clarity that the librarian was not asking him to forget history. She was asking him to decide if he was a scholar of life or a curator of paper. He felt the pressure of his own grip on the spine of the book. His knuckles were white, his breath was shallow, and his heart was racing with the fear that if he let go, he would be nothing. He looked at the fire, then at the empty shelf on the other side of the room. It was not a void, it was an invitation. It was a space that could not be filled until he cleared away the things he was already carrying. He didn't throw the book into the fire. That would have been another act of performance, another dramatic gesture of control. Instead, he simply laid the iron-bound volume on the floor, some distance from the heat. He stood up, his legs stiff, his hands feeling strangely light. He walked to the shelf, took a deep breath, and began to arrange the scrolls that were waiting to be transcribed. For the first time, he was not looking at the dates. He was not checking the genealogies. He was simply feeling the texture of the paper, the weight of the work, and the steady, quiet rhythm of his own presence in the archive. He stayed in the room until the fire had burned down to a pile of soft gray ash. He did not feel enlightened. He did not feel relieved of all his burdens. He felt tired. He felt vulnerable. He felt like a man who had finally stepped out of a long, dark tunnel and wasn't quite sure how to handle the sudden, overwhelming reality of the light. But he also felt something else, a small, persistent sense of curiosity. He looked at the stack of empty, waiting shelves, and for the first time in his life, he didn't see a tragedy, he saw a possibility. The librarian returned, carrying a fresh lamp. She didn't ask him what he had done with the book. She didn't ask him if he was ready to let go. She simply placed the lamp on the floor, illuminating the entire chamber, and went back to her work in the aisles. Kalen knelt down, picked up the iron-bound volume from the floor, and without thinking, placed it on the shelf that was meant for new records. It wasn't a rejection of the past. It was a recognition that the past had a place, and that place was not in his hands. He walked back to the main hall, his footsteps echoing in the silence. The scrolls remained where they were. The archives were just as they had been. But the person who was walking through them was different. He was a person who was no longer rereading his life. He was a person who was beginning to notice the way the light fell through the high windows, the way the dust motes danced in the air, and the way his own breath was the only archive that truly needed his attention. He didn't know what he would do the next day, and he didn't know what the next chapter would bring. But for the first time, that uncertainty didn't feel like a threat. It felt like a blank page, waiting for the ink of his own life to touch it, not out of duty, but out of existence. You might be able to see yourself in the library of Kalen. You have been carrying your own heavy iron-bound books for a long time, convinced that you are the sole guardian of your own history. You have been rereading the chapters of your failures, your regrets, and your missed opportunities, believing that if you just study them carefully enough, you will find the secret to not being hurt again. But the parchment is drying out, the ink is fading, and the weight of the book is preventing you from reaching for the shelf where the new life is waiting. You are not the archive. You are not the curator of your past. You are the scholar who is allowed to step away from the fire, take a deep breath, and realize that the shelves are not there to hold your burden, they are there to hold your space. And that space is wide, and it is ready, and it is not asking you to rewrite yesterday. It is only asking you to show up with empty hands for the story that is about to begin. The archives that Kalen spent his life guarding represent the mental structures we build to keep the past intact. This story is not telling us that our history is without value, nor is it suggesting that we should burn the memories that define who we are. It is showing us something much quieter and more essential. The realization that the exhaustion you feel is rarely caused by the events themselves, but by the relentless labor of maintaining those events in the museum of your mind. When the scroll crumbled in Kalen's hands, the initial shock was a simple reality of working with fragile, aged materials. That is the first experience of being human the moment our plans encounter the unpredictable, decaying nature of the world. That friction is unavoidable, and it is natural to feel a sting when something we love or rely upon begins to fray. However, the suffering that kept Kalen in the dark, the suffocating anxiety that turned his archive into a tomb, was a secondary layer. Altogether, it was the layer he constructed as a desperate defense against the prospect of a blank shelf. We add this layer because we are terrified that if we let go of our past mistakes or our former identities, we will lose our solid ground. We build a persona of constancy, a museum of our own history, and we spend our most precious vitality polishing the glass cases. We become so busy ensuring that our internal narrative is preserved that we lose contact with the very thing that makes life vibrant, the ability to exist in a space that hasn't yet been written. Buddhist wisdom helps us recognize that we are usually far more exhausted by this secondary labor of preservation than by the actual challenges of our present lives. What the librarian showed Kalen was that the archives were not a sanctuary. They were a barrier that kept him from witnessing the light as it moved across the floor. The scrolls he guarded were beautiful, yes, and they told the truth of what had happened. But they were static, cold, and entirely closed. They had no capacity for warmth because they were designed to be filed, not to be lived. We do the same when we believe that we must present an invulnerable, permanently tethered version of ourselves to those around us, or when we insist on rereading the chapters of our regret as if they were maps to our future. We think that by shielding our vulnerability or our desire for something new, we are protecting our identity, but we are actually creating an island of isolation. We become the very thing we fear, a person who is defined by what has already ended, rather than what is waiting to emerge. This is what it means to stop adding a second wound to the first. We are so often our own most rigid archivists, standing over our own lives with the invisible tape of self-judgment, trying to mend any part of our story that seems to have torn. We tell ourselves that if we feel lost, we must have failed to categorize our lives correctly. If we feel afraid, we must be losing our grip on the truth. But this is a misunderstanding of what it means to be alive. The beauty of a human life is found in its capacity to change, to transition, to release, and to continue. You do not need to be a perfectly preserved manuscript to be worthy of belonging. You are, and always have been, a person who is being written by the experiences that pass through you. And the empty shelves in your mind are not failures, they are the space where your future is waiting to be composed. Consider the energy you spend recataloguing your past, or the mental rehearsals you conduct to ensure you are consistently the person you were yesterday. You are using your current vitality, your present moment awareness, to curate a history that no one else is actually requiring you to hold. You are trying to live in a chapter that you have already walked out of. When you catch yourself doing this, try to see it as the act of an archivist who is so frightened of the empty shelf that they refuse to let the space exist. You are so busy mourning the conclusion of the previous chapter that you are failing to notice the warmth of the sun falling through the high windows. This is not about being reckless or careless with your history. It is about understanding that the quality of your presence depends not on the volume of your past, but on your willingness to be here, in the archive of the now, without the armor of the old records. The mind, in its search for safety, desperately wants the world to be composed of predictable sequences. It thinks that if it can just manage the past, it will finally be safe from the pain of being surprised or the pain of being lost. But true connection is not a product of continuity, it is a product of resonance. We connect with ourselves and others not because we are perfectly consistent, but because we are real. When we allow ourselves to acknowledge that the drought is over, even if the record of it remains, we invite our spirits to move into the new air. We break the cycle of stagnation by daring to exist in the space where the shelf is empty. You do not need to be a finished volume to be present. You only need to be the person who is currently sitting, breathing, and looking out from beneath the weight of the library. This teaching is meant to be a release from the exhausting work of maintaining your own museum. You have been gluing silk strips to the tears of your life, trying to hide any part of your story that feels too much or out of place. And it is a labor that yields nothing but a thinner, more brittle sense of self. Your soul is not a scroll that needs to be stored in an iron-bound case. It is the space where the writing occurs. When you look at your own restlessness with compassion, you are not condoning your pain and you are not pretending the day was easy. You are simply choosing to honor the totality of your own life, including the moments that didn't go according to the text. As you reflect on this, notice where the tension sits in your body. Does it gather in the tightness of your jaw when you think of the expectations you feel you must maintain? Does it sink into your shoulders like a heavy, unseen weight? This is the physical sign that you are still trying to hold the book shut. You are bracing yourself against the reality of your own human transition. If it feels right, take a slow, deep breath and consciously let the muscles release. You are not performing for a scholar tonight. You are not holding the archive for a king. You are simply breathing in the quiet of this room, acknowledging that the chapters you have lived, even if they were difficult, even if they were filled with dust, have brought you to this shelf, and this shelf is safe. You have done nothing wrong by being a person who has lived, learned, and occasionally felt the burden of it all. The capacity to witness your own life with kindness is the most radical form of discipline you will ever practice. It is not an invitation to be dismissive or to ignore your own needs. It is an invitation to be honest. When you are not busy hiding your blank pages from yourself, you are free to feel the warmth of your own heart. When you are not busy managing the record of your performance, you are free to hear the sound of the wind or the rhythm of your own pulse. You are free to take the scroll and see the simplicity of the truth rather than the complexity of the filing system. This is the difference between a life lived in fear of being discovered as incomplete and a life lived in the comfort of being in motion. You do not have to reach any particular conclusion about your identity tonight. You do not need to label your day as successful or wasted. You only need to notice the space that is open before you, the space where the rest is calling. And that space is wide, and it is welcoming, and it is entirely unburdened by the expectations that governed your afternoon. You are not the scroll, and you are not the file. You are the one who is beneath it all, and you are the one who has the freedom to decide that for now it is safe to set the heavy book down if you do not feel like reading it anymore. This is the profound, quiet power of the present moment. It is always a blank page, even when the archive is cluttered with the records of the day. If you feel the urge to tighten your grip, if you feel the old, familiar rhythm of the archive pulling at your awareness, simply name it. Just say, "I am trying to keep the book shut." Say it with gentleness, as if you were speaking to a companion who is afraid to be seen without their credentials. You do not need to fight the fear, and you do not need to agree with the requirement to remain categorized. You can just notice the urge, hold it in your awareness, and know that the library is already finished, and the evening is as it needs to be. You are moving into a deeper, slower rhythm now, one where the urgency of the expectations begins to fade into the steady, predictable heartbeat of the present. There is nowhere else to be, and there is no standard you must meet before you are permitted to let the parchment rest. You are doing perfectly well, simply by being here, simply by listening, and simply by choosing to stop fighting the weight of the archive. And perhaps this is where the teaching begins to touch your own heart in the quiet realization that you are not the ink but the paper upon which the light can finally land. If it feels right, allow your eyes to rest in a soft, unfocused gaze, or simply let the lids drift closed, shutting out the world for a while. We are going to sit with the parchment and the ink, not to finish a manuscript, but to understand the texture of the narrative you have been straining to protect. There is no need for your body to be perfect, or your mind to be silent. Simply notice the weight of your own existence, the way the mattress supports your limbs, the way the cool air greets your face, and the way your mind, in this quiet, might still be reaching out to smooth over the frayed edges of a day you have already lived, desperate to ensure the story remains consistent. If you feel a tightness in your chest, or a familiar, stiff bracing in your shoulders, where you usually prepare to meet the demands of your own expectations, gently turn your attention to that sensation. You might imagine that heavy, iron-bound volume sitting on the floor beside you, right there in the open space of your room. It is a dense, dusty, and cumbersome thing, and for years your hands have been busy binding its pages, convinced that if you could just keep it closed, if you could just keep the record intact, the world would remain stable. Just for these few minutes, invite your fingers to unfold. You do not have to discard the story entirely. You only have to stop squeezing the spine so tightly. Notice what happens in your lungs when you imagine the binding loosening and your hands finally becoming still. Perhaps you feel a flicker of apprehension when you do this, the worry that if you are not actively proofreading your life, the chapters will scatter, and the people around you will see the blank, unwritten spaces underneath, and they will lose interest. That is a natural reaction. That worry is just the ghost of your old habit, whispering that your belonging is tied to your status as an archivist. But notice the sensation of that worry. Where does it live? Is it in the throat, tightening as if to keep you from admitting you are tired of the record? Is it in the belly? A sharp, cold knot of concern about what might happen if the book were left open to the wind. Do not try to move it or dissolve it. Just observe it as a guest, one that has been sitting in your library for a very long time. You can acknowledge its presence without inviting it to take over the shelf. As you breathe, imagine the light in the room dimming further until all the sharpness of your daily roles is blurred away. In this softened space, picture the library again. It is sitting in a sun-drenched, quiet place where no one expects you to be a scholar, a protector, or a keeper of history. The parchment is cool, textured, and perfectly content to be just a leaf. There is no one there to judge whether you are finished, whether you are successful, or whether you are still searching for the right words. You are simply watching the material from a distance. If a thought of tomorrow enters, or if a memory of a time you felt pressured to prove your worth knocks on the door, try to visualize that thought as a single, loose page drifting toward the floor. You do not need to glue it back in place. You do not need to mend the tear with silk. You can simply hold the image of it in your mind and let it be what it is, a bit of drift, a bit of the passing wind. You don't have to explain it. You don't have to apologize for it. Just acknowledge that the page is floating, and then let your focus shift back to the feeling of your chest rising and falling. A rhythm that requires no archive to guide it. The breath does not need a record to verify its arrival. It knows the way through the silence without needing to justify its existence to anyone. Every time you find yourself trying to force your inner life to match the rigid sequence of your past, recognize that you are reaching for the glue again. When you notice this, you don't need to be frustrated with yourself. Simply say, "I see you. Archivist, I see you, fear." And then, with the tenderness you would show a tired child who has spent the day trying to hold a heavy burden, let your hands relax. If you feel the need to preserve, let that need be seen, but stay with the breath. Let the breath be the anchor. The breath does not require a library to validate it. It is happening now, in the space where the shelves are cleared, and that is sufficient. If it feels right, you might place a hand on your heart, or perhaps on your belly, where the anxiety of being prepared often gathers its strength. Feel the warmth of your own skin. This is the only territory you are truly responsible for tonight. You are not responsible for the order of your history, for the opinions of your younger self, or for the eventual. perfect construction of your legacy, you are responsible only for this, being the witness to your own texture, rather than the person shackled to the library of your own expectations. Notice the sound of the silence. It is not empty. It is full of the potential for rest. If your mind is still busy, if it is still reciting the litany of things you must do to keep the binding tight, simply imagine these stories as shadows flickering against the archive wall. They appear, they move, and they pass, just like sunlight shifting across the floorboards. You are the space. You are the room that holds the shadows, but you are not the shadows themselves. The room does not get tired from the light moving through it. The room does not get bruised by the shapes on the wall. The room simply provides the capacity for these things to exist, and then inevitably it returns to its own quiet, steady state. You don't need to do anything with this observation. You don't need to analyze the shape of the worry or the heaviness of the binding. Even noticing that you are noticing is enough. That small, brief moment of recognition where you realize, I am guarding the past right now, is the moment the page begins to lift. It is the moment you step back from the iron-bound volume and into the garden of your own awareness. Stay with the sensation of the weight on the bed. Feel how the mattress is perfectly capable of holding you. You do not need to hold your own history together. You do not need to keep the binding stiff with your own anxious energy. You can allow the floor to hold the library, the earth to hold the floor, and the presence of the night to hold you. There is a deep, ancient, and undeniable safety in this surrender. It is not a surrender to oblivion. It is a surrender to reality. And reality is far more spacious than your archives have ever dared to admit. If the mind wanders back to the lists and the worries, simply bring it back to the touch of your hand on your skin. That contact is real. The warmth is real. The rhythm of your heart is real. The need to be a finished volume is just a projection, a mental performance, a story told in the language of fear. Let the story play if it must, but do not give it your energy. Do not feed it with your attention. Let it be a sound in the distance, like the wind in the eaves, something that you hear, but that does not require you to get up and fix it. You are safe enough to soften. You are safe enough to let the quill slip from your fingers. You are safe enough to be a person who is simply resting, without a library, without a history to maintain, without a record to uphold. Take one more slow, deep breath, and as you exhale, imagine the tension leaving your jaw, flowing out like cool water returning to the stream, until there is nothing left but the quiet, simple pulse of your own life. You are doing perfectly well. Just stay with the rhythm, and trust that the night is here to help you let the page turn. And but for a moment, consider that the peace you have been wandering through all your life was never a destination you had to record, but the very ground that was holding you up while you looked for it. In a high mountain valley where the autumn winds consistently stripped the trees to their barest limbs, there lived a young woman named Alara who made her living as a weaver. Her craft was exquisite. She created tapestries that were so tightly knotted, so meticulously patterned, that they were said to hold the warmth of the sun through the longest winters. But Alara was haunted by a single, invisible thread, a memory of a mistake she had made years ago, an error in judgment that had cost her family their homestead. She believed that if she could just weave the perfect tapestry, if she could just find the exact shade of crimson and the most intricate pattern of gold, she would somehow compensate for the past, restoring the home she had lost. She worked until her fingers were raw, her neck stiffened by the hours of hunched concentration, her mind constantly replaying the moment of the error, as if she could pull the thread of the past and straighten it out with her own hands. Her teacher was an elderly hermit who lived in a small, windowless shack nearby, a man known for nothing but his ability to sit in total silence for days on end. Alara often visited him, bringing her unfinished tapestries, desperate for his praise or his confirmation that her work was becoming beautiful enough to erase the wound. The hermit would look at the tapestry, look at her hands, and then look out at the valley, where the leaves were falling to the ground in a chaotic, unpatterned heap. He would simply offer her a cup of warm water and say nothing. The silence began to feel like a judgment to Alara. She interpreted it as a sign that her efforts were still insufficient, that she had not yet found the secret pattern that would set her free. One afternoon, the wind in the valley turned sharp, a freezing gale that threatened to destroy the last of the harvest. Alara rushed to her loom, intent on finishing a complex border, terrified that if she stopped now, the cold would somehow seep into her heart and freeze the memory of her failure even tighter. As she worked, a gust of wind tore the door of her weaving hut open, and a swirl of dry, brittle leaves flooded the space. Landing on her loom, her thread, and her lap, she screamed in frustration, grabbing at the leaves, trying to shield the tapestry. But the more she fought, the more the thread snarled, and the more the loom began to creak under the strain of her panic. She felt the heavy, familiar ache of not enough, the crushing sensation that life was actively conspiring to undo her work. She fled the hut and ran to the hermit's shack, burst through the door, and collapsed at his feet, sobbing that she was tired, that the pattern was impossible, that the wind wouldn't stop, and that the past was always reaching into her present to ruin it. The hermit didn't look at her tapestry. He didn't ask her about the error. He stood up, walked to the corner of his room, and picked up a heavy rusted iron key that had hung on the wall for decades. He held it out to her. "This key opens the storage shed in the garden," he said quietly. "There is a stack of heavy woolen blankets inside. Bring them here." Alara wiped her tears, feeling a strange surge of irritation. Why blankets? She needed wisdom. She needed to know how to fix the weave. But the hermit's gaze was steady, expectant, and kind. She took the key, went to the shed, and found the blankets. They were rough, gray, and worn, but they were remarkably warm. She brought them to the shack. The hermit took one, draped it over his shoulders, and sat by the fire. He didn't ask for her help. He didn't ask for her story. He just watched the fire. Alara sat, trembling, the cold still deep in her bones, her mind racing with the failure in the hut, the ruined threads, and the loss of the homestead. After a long time, the hermit reached out and touched the sleeve of Alara's tunic. "You are trying to weave a blanket of gold to cover a wound that only needs warmth," he said. "The error you made, the mistake that you carry it, is not a hole in your tapestry. It is the reason you are cold. You have been trying to make the past into a decoration, so that you can look at it without trembling. But the past is not a pattern to be edited. It is a season that has passed. The tree does not try to glue its fallen leaves back onto its branches when the winter arrives. It lets them fall, and it stands bare, and it waits for the sap to rise again in the spring." Alara looked at her hands, still stained with the indigo dye of her trade. She had spent years trying to weave a life that was invulnerable, a life where nothing could go wrong, so that she would never have to feel that cold, sharp pang of regret again. She realized then that the regret wasn't the tragedy. The tragedy was the life she had missed while she was trying to hide from the cold. She didn't have to be a perfect weaver to deserve warmth. She didn't have to be a master of history to be allowed to sit by the fire. She looked at the hermit, and for the first time she didn't look for a lesson. She looked for a person. She saw the lines on his face, the way his hands rested calmly on his knees, and the way he existed in the room without needing to improve anything. She took a breath, a slow, deep, shuddering breath that reached all the way to the base of her spine. She didn't say, "I am healed." She didn't say, "I will never think of the homestead again." She simply said, "It is very cold outside, isn't it?" The hermit nodded, a slight, almost imperceptible tilt of his head. "It is cold," he agreed, "and you are here." That small shift, the move from "I must weave" to be safe to "I am here, and it is cold," was the start of her transformation. Alara didn't stop weaving. She returned to her loom the next day, and she finished the tapestry, but the border was different. It was simpler. It didn't try to hide the knots. It allowed them to be part of the pattern. She still remembered the mistake. She still felt the pang of regret when she passed the old homestead, but she no longer stopped to try and rebuild it in her mind. She walked past it, acknowledging the ache, letting it be the weather of her heart, and then continuing on toward her own day. She learned that the tapestry of a human life is not meant to be a flawless piece of art. It is meant to be a garment that keeps us warm as we travel through the world. The knots, the tangles, and the places where the thread had to be rejoined were not marks of shame. They were the strongest parts of the fabric. They were where the resilience lived. And whenever the wind began to howl, whenever the leaves began to blow against the door of her hut, she would stop reaching for the thread to fight it. She would sit, she would breathe, and she would remind herself, the tree stands bare, and the tree is enough. Transformation is not the act of removing the knots. It is the act of recognizing that you are the one who is wearing the garment, not the one who is trapped by it. When you feel the weight of your own history, when you feel the sudden, sharp return of the regret, do not try to weave it into a different shape. Do not try to disguise it with gold or crimson silk. Let it be what it is, a part of the texture, a part of the history, a part of the warmth. You are already whole. You were whole when you made the mistake. You were whole when you were trying to fix it. And you are whole now, sitting in the quiet of this night, listening to the story of the weaver who finally learned to sit by the fire. You are the one who is breathing, and that breath is the golden thread that connects everything, no matter how frayed the edges may seem. As you lie here, allow the memory of your own mistakes to lose their sharp, stinging definition. Imagine them as threads in a tapestry that is already finished. You do not need to pull them out. You do not need to reweave the pattern. You only need to accept that they exist, that they have held you, and that they are part of the complex, beautiful, and completely honest pattern of your own life. The weaver is resting. The loom is silent, and the warmth you have been seeking is not in the tapestry, it is in the person who is finally gently allowing themselves to simply exist. When we consider the weight Kalin felt in his stone archive, or the raw fatigue Alara carried at her creaking loom, we are looking directly into the intricate machinery of our own late-night thoughts. The exhaustion that sits behind your eyes right now is not the simple fatigue of a body that has walked through a long day. It is the deep, structural weariness of a mind that has spent hours attempting to perform the impossible task of managing reality. We live under the quiet, persistent illusion that if we can just exert enough control over our narrative, if we can just anticipate every single shift in the wind and perfectly preserve every chapter of our past, we will finally achieve a state of permanent safety. We treat our lives like a manuscript that must be constantly protected from edits, revisions, and the natural weathering of time. This deep-seated need for certainty manifests as a quiet, relentless friction within the heart. You find yourself replaying old conversations in the dark, turning a single phrase over and over, trying to find a way to rewrite what has already been recorded in the permanent ink of history. Or perhaps you find yourself rehearsing the days to come, constructing elaborate mental blueprints for scenarios that may never arrive, all in an effort to ensure you are never caught unprepared by a blank page. We call this process preparation, and we tell ourselves that it is a form of wisdom. But if we observe it closely, we can feel the high, anxious cost of this vigilance. It is fear masquerading as protection. It is the mind trying to build a fortress out of thoughts, unaware that the very walls we are building are what keep us isolated from the fluid, changing beauty of the present moment. In the language of the heart, Buddhist wisdom draws a vital distinction between the initial impact of life and the subsequent stories we tell ourselves about that impact. One of the great insights of the classical tradition points to the reality of the two arrows. The first arrow represents the pain that life brings to our doorstep without our consent. It is the sudden storm that disrupts the harvest, the project that crumbles despite our best intentions, the word that hurts, or the ending of a chapter we were not ready to close. This first pain is an inevitable condition of being a human being in an impermanent world. It is the raw material of existence, untamed and unpredictable. We cannot control where the first arrow lands, and it is natural, soft, and entirely appropriate to grieve the wound it leaves behind. But the mind, in its desperate attempt to avoid feeling vulnerable, almost immediately fires a second arrow into the very same wound. This second arrow is our resistance. It is the self-judgment that demands to know why we were not strong enough to dodge the first blow. It is the inner voice that transforms a temporary misfortune into a permanent statement about our core value, whispering that because a chapter has ended in failure, the entire book of our life must be fundamentally flawed. We add layers of shame, regret, and anxiety to the original hurt, believing somehow that if we punish ourselves severely enough, we can force the world to become predictable. We turn a passing wave of sadness into a permanent identity, wrapping ourselves so tightly in the cloak of our history that we forget who we are without the burden of our grievances. Slowly, The teaching becomes personal when you realize that you have the capacity to stop feeding that secondary struggle. You may not be able to erase the ink on the pages you have already turned, and you may not be able to prevent the wind from shaking the windows of your house tomorrow. But you can choose to lay down the iron-binding press of your self-criticism tonight. You can notice the moment your mind begins to build an entire archive out of a single mistake, and you can gently, compassionately choose to step away from the workbench. Peace is not a state where life ceases to be difficult, nor is it a sanctuary where no sad chapters are ever written. True peace is a completely different relationship with that difficulty. It is the willingness to sit in the room while the storm rages outside, recognizing that the storm is simply the weather of the world, not a judgment on the quality of your soul. When you look closely at your own habit of overthinking, you can see that it is often an attempt to fix the self through the application of shame. We believe that if we keep our failures vividly alive in our memory, we will remain humble and protected from future arrogance. But shame is a heavy, static thing. It behaves like dry clay that hardens around our joints until we can no longer move with the natural rhythm of life. It convinces us that we are the mistake itself, rather than the person who experienced the mistake. Buddhist wisdom invites us to look at our past with the soft, discerning eye of awareness rather than the harsh glare of judgment. Awareness sees the tear in the parchment and simply notes its existence. It does not draft a long, condemning thesis on the worthlessness of the scholar who held the paper. This shift in perspective requires us to abandon the constant search for approval from a world that is itself completely unstable. We check our digital screens. We scan the faces of others, and we look back at our own achievements, always seeking a final, definitive sign that we have done enough to earn our place on the earth. We are like a weaver who refuses to wrap themselves in their own garment until every stranger in the marketplace has verified the quality of the wool. But the validation we are seeking is an impermanent cloud, constantly shifting shape with the passing opinions of the day. The only shelf space that truly matters is the one you clear within your own heart, the space where you allow your own tired hands to rest without needing a certificate of completion to justify the stillness. What happens when you stop treating every anxious thought as an absolute truth and begin to see it simply as a passing gust of wind through an open window? You begin to realize that the mind is a vast, open landscape capable of holding many different kinds of weather without being destroyed by any of them. You can feel the anxiety rise. You can notice the familiar urge to reread yesterday's regrets, and instead of immediately reaching for the glue and the silk to fix it, you can simply take a slow, deep breath. You can say to yourself, with immense gentleness, "This is the second arrow. I do not have to pull the bowstring tonight." In that single moment of recognition, the grip of the old pattern begins to soften. You are no longer the character trapped in the predictable tragedy of your own worries. You are the awareness that is watching the play unfold, steady, unmoving, and perfectly safe. You do not need to hate yourself for the long hours you have spent guarding the closed chapters of your life. The habit of resistance was built out of a genuine desire to keep your heart from being broken again. It was an act of survival, a clumsy form of self-love that tried to protect you by keeping you rigid. But tonight you can thank that old guard for its service and gently inform it that it is safe to sleep. The house is secure, the book is closed, and the empty pages of tomorrow do not require your midnight editing to be beautiful. You are learning to trust the natural resilience of your own skin, the inherent strength of a spirit that has survived every single chapter it has ever lived through, even the ones that were written in tears. Let the clarity of this understanding settle into the deeper rhythms of your body. Feel the way your breath moves in and out of your lungs, a gentle rhythmic proof that life is continuing to sustain you without any active management from your intellect. You do not have to hold the world together tonight. You do not have to prove your competence. You do not have to validate your history. And you do not have to resolve the great mysteries of your purpose before you are permitted to let your eyes close. You are a living presence, beautiful in your transitions, whole in your imperfections, and completely entitled to the quiet that is currently rising to meet you. The archive is silent. The loom has stopped its turning. and you are finally entering the space where the story is allowed to rest, unread, unedited, and perfectly at peace in the dark. The transition from the stillness of the mountain library into the rapid rhythm of your own days is where the true narrative of your life is actually written. It is easy to feel a sense of clarity when you are listening to the story of a man who finally laid his heavy iron-bound book aside. But when you are caught in the middle of a Tuesday, staring at a screen while waiting for a text that refuses to arrive, the parchment in your hands often feels far heavier than it did in the quiet. You might find yourself checking your phone for some kind of reassurance, hoping that a single notification will settle the flutter in your chest and confirm that you are worthy, that you are remembered, that you are still a vital part of the story. When the reply does not come, you may feel your mind immediately beginning to reach for the tape and the glue, trying to mend the perceived tear, trying to rewrite your own message to be more perfect, more engaging, more acceptable. In those moments of modern solitude, you are trying to force a shape onto the day that it refuses to take. Instead of following the thread of that panic, try taking one breath before you reach for the screen again. Just one. That breath is not a solution to the silence, but it is a way of reclaiming your own agency. It is an act of recognizing that you can exist in the uncertainty without immediately needing to fill it with a defensive performance of your own adequacy. Maybe you find yourself lying awake long after the house has gone quiet, replaying a conversation where you felt clumsy, exposed, or misunderstood. You are back in that moment, mentally editing your words, trying to imagine how you could have been sharper, more composed, or more impressive. You are attempting to proofread a page that has already been bound into the volume of your past. This is the habit of the archivist who fears the blank shelf. You believe that if you study the error long enough, you will prevent it from ever happening again. But this is the second arrow, the injury you inflict upon your own peace to make up for the limitation that already occurred. When you catch yourself doing this, try to visualize that memory not as a stain on your history, but as a single leaf that has fallen to the ground. It is there. It is part of the landscape. You do not need to pull it out of the dirt and press it back onto the tree. You do not need to discard the entire season. You can simply acknowledge that the leaf has turned. Forgive yourself for being a person who is still learning to navigate the winds of change, and let your focus return to the texture of your pillow, the weight of your body, and the fact that you are safe in this room, right now. There is often a pervasive pressure to feel like you are behind in the story, that others have mastered the art of living, while yours remains a series of revisions and crossed-out lines. You might feel the burden of performing your stability, of keeping the binding tight even when you are feeling hollow or fragile. You offer help to others, you smile through the fatigue, you maintain the appearance of a master of your own destiny. But inside, you feel the strain of holding up a volume that you are terrified will be judged as empty. This is the exhaustion of the scholar who has become a statue. It is the effort of maintaining a version of yourself that is meant for the archive, at the expense of the person who just needs to feel the warmth of their own breath. You do not have to be the repository of every achievement. You are allowed to be the space around the book. You are allowed to admit that you are tired, to say I do not have the narrative figured out yet, or to simply step away from the shelves for an evening. Your worth is not a published work. It is not something you have to earn through your output, your charm, or the perfection of your composure. It is inherent, and it is here, whether you are productive or whether you are still. Consider the times you feel the sudden, sharp need to control a relationship, to force an outcome because you are terrified of losing the connection or being revealed as less than. You might find yourself over-explaining, apologizing for your presence, or checking in too often, all in an effort to keep the pages from blowing away in the draft. But when you pull a story too tight, you don't strengthen the binding, you make it brittle. You make it prone to snapping under the pressure of your own anxiety. Real connection is found in the spaces where there is no tension. It is found when you can allow the other person to be who they are, without needing them to fulfill a role in your internal ledger of safety. You can care deeply without gripping the quill so hard your hands bleed. You can offer love without making it a transaction of validation. This requires a specific kind of courage, the courage to risk being seen without the bibliography of your achievements, and the courage to trust that you are enough, even if the other person does not mirror your efforts exactly as you expected. You may also struggle with the feeling that you have not earned your rest, that if you aren't constantly solving, analyzing, or preparing for the next chapter, you are being irresponsible. You might feel guilty for sitting in a quiet room without a task, or for closing your eyes before the house is perfectly in order. This is the belief that rest is a reward to be unlocked by your productivity, rather than a fundamental necessity of the living, breathing human form. You do not have to earn the right to exist. You do not have to prove your value to the archives before you are allowed to close your eyes. When that guilt arises, treat it like a dry, dusty quill that has served its purpose for the day. Acknowledge that the guilt is a habit, a voice from the past that equates survival with endless scribbling. You can choose to set it down. You can choose to rest simply because you are here, and the body, like the earth itself, requires seasons of fallow time to remain vibrant. It is helpful to remember that mindfulness is not an escape from these modern pressures. It is a way to inhabit them differently. A breath before you answer an email is not a waste of time. It is a form of wisdom that protects the integrity of your own spirit. Choosing not to engage in a toxic spiral of comparison when you see someone else's highlight reel on a screen is not weakness. It is a profound act of self-discipline. You are creating a boundary between the world's constant noise and your own internal study. Every time you consciously return to the present, you are choosing to walk the path without trying to turn it into a museum. You are saying, I will meet the future when it arrives, but for now I am here in my own skin, and that is sufficient. Even in the smallest moments, the way you hold a cup of tea, the way you listen to the sound of the rain, the way you walk through a doorway, you can practice this. You do not need to leave your life to find the temple. The temple is the attention you bring to these moments. When you feel the familiar pull to worry, pause and ask yourself, is this worry helping me? Is it solving anything? Or is it just the rhythm of the quill scratching at the parchment? If it is just the scratching, then let it sit. You do not have to carry the burden of the library tonight. You can step away. You can soften your jaw, and you can let the silence of the room be your guide. This does not mean the difficulties of your life will vanish. The responsibilities will still be there. The conversations will still be complex, and the future will remain unwritten. But you will meet these things with a different spirit. You will meet them as someone who is rooted, someone who knows that their identity is not tied to the perfection of the book they carry. You will meet them with the quiet, steady strength of a scholar who understands that the beauty of the life is in the gaps, the shifts, and the willingness to let the page turn. You are learning that you are not the writer of the world's destiny. You are the one who gets to participate in the shaping for a brief, precious span of time. And that is enough. It is more than enough. Stay with this feeling of lightness. The next moments are yours to simply inhabit, without trying to capture them or bind them into something they are not yet. You are doing perfectly well, and the night is finally holding you with a gentleness you are ready to receive. The iron binding press has been set aside, and the heavy, dust-covered volume of your yesterday is finally resting on the solid stone of the present. You have been laboring for so long in the dim light of that archive, convinced that if you could just find the right words to tape back into place, the story of your life would hold its shape. But tonight, the library is cool and silent, and the ink on your fingers is beginning to dry and fade. There is no one here to check the records, no one waiting to verify the genealogies of your regrets, and no one requiring you to justify the space you have occupied. You are simply a traveler who has reached the end of the aisle, and the room before you is quiet, unwritten, and entirely safe. Feel how the mattress supports the weight of your body, no longer strained, no longer braced against the next chapter, but soft and yielding as a piece of parchment left to rest in the moonlight. The archives were never the truth of who you were. They were only the evidence of where you had been. But the lamps have been trimmed now, the shadows are drawing close, and you are allowed to be seen in the raw, unwritten potential of your own stillness. Your hands beneath the memory of the quill and the glue are soft, untroubled, and resting in the stillness. You are not a character caught in the iron-bound constraints of a finished volume. You are the space where the life is occurring, and that space is wide, and it is deep, and it is entirely untainted by the tears you spent your days trying to mend. Let the book close. Let the dust settle on the shelves. You do not need to read it again. It was only ever a chapter, a sequence of events, and tonight you are finally breaking through to the center of your own quiet. Listen to the rhythm of your breath. It is the only scholar you need to trust now. With every long, slow exhale, you are releasing the last remnants of the narrative you carried through the doorway of this night. You are becoming as still as the stone floor of the archive, as silent as the ink in the well, as gentle as the fog moving through the eaves. The weight in your shoulders is dissolving, slipping away into the earth, returning to the silence that gave it birth. Your jaw is loose, your forehead is smooth, and the space behind your eyes is opening into a vast empty expanse where you are free to wander without a timeline and without a title. You are not a manuscript. You are not a record. You are the life that is breathing, and that is a story complete in itself. Everything you felt today, the frantic need to categorize, the fear of the blank shelf, the desire to be understood by the past, the anxiety about the future, all of it is settling into the bottom of the archive, no longer stirring the air, no longer demanding your attention. It is a part of your history, yes, but it is not the commander of your soul. You are allowed to stop editing your own existence. You are allowed to stop proofreading your own potential. You are allowed to simply exist in the quiet, undisturbed by the need to be anything other than a person who is finally, deeply, profoundly allowed to sleep. The shadows of the room are holding you. The silence of the night is wrapping around you. And the wisdom you sought was never in the records, but in the person who was waiting to breathe the air all along. You are drifting now, floating on the surface of a deep, dark stillness, where the only movement is the gentle pulse of your own heart. There is no rush to wake, no schedule to honor, no archive to organize when the morning comes. The morning will take care of itself, just as the season takes care of the falling leaf, and just as the silence takes care of the sound. You have done enough. You have been enough, even on the days when you felt most like a stranger in your own story. You have carried your own weight through the long, demanding hours, and now, the time for carrying is over. The glue is dried, the shelves are empty, and the night is a blanket of pure, unadulterated rest, sinking deeper now into the heavy velvet dark. Each breath is a descent into a place where the labels cannot follow, where the identity you were constructing and the history you were preserving are just soft, distant echoes of a day that has ended. You are becoming the night self, vast, inclusive, and profoundly still. Nothing needs to be said. Nothing needs to be done. Nothing needs to be proven. You are a human being, not a human doing, and tonight you are finally inhabiting the truth of that peace. Feel your limbs becoming part of the bed. Feel your breath becoming part of the room. Feel your heart beating in the slow, ancient time of the earth. You are safe. You are held. You are home. If the world was once a place of edges, archives, and boundaries to be maintained, tonight it is a place of endless, opening space. You can let go of the last threads of the day, the last flickers of the anxiety, the last fragments of the story you were trying to mold into perfection. They are not yours to keep. They are not yours to guard. They are only the mist passing through the library, and the stone does not mind the mist. It simply stands, and it rests, and it waits in the quiet dark. You are resting, you are healing, and you are finally beginning to see that the blank page you feared was the only one that was ever truly free. And if the silence you have been running from was actually the home you were looking for, would you finally stop editing the light,